It's big and round there,
Yeah.
and it's got this little wiggly tail right there.
Right there.
And that's how you can tell it's a Q.
Yeah, it's nice.
Hey, Bert, you know what I...
3, guy. You think it's 3? Look at the addition board. 2 plus 1 equals 3. You're absolutely right.
One of the things we wanted was to give poor children the same break that middle-class children were getting in terms of arriving in school with some preparation.
Count with me all together. Ready?
1.
In 1969, Sesame Street was built around the idea that early education could create a path to a better future.
Hey, listen, do you know what this is?
But I think the legacy is in its impact, in the fact that children who grew up on Sesame Street perform better throughout their lifetime.
We've taken our proven model across the globe, where local partners help us meet the specific needs of children. Our engaging characters not only teach kids their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, but help them overcome challenges, both big and small.
It's okay to feel whatever way you feel.
Really?
Really.
These characters are so powerful, and that gives us an opportunity to make a huge difference for children around the world.
We're giving all children access to the life-changing benefits of education, especially the most vulnerable. In parts of the world where girls in particular are left behind, our inspiring female characters help children, girls as well as boys, broaden their sense of women's potential.
I want to be a doctor too!
It's one thing for them to know they can be anything, but it's another thing to give them what they need to get there.
And where children's health is threatened by illness and disease, our characters are furry friends who can teach them life-saving behaviors.
Nice and clean, Elmo! You have to make sure water is clean before you drink it.
When children are healthy, they can stay in school and continue to thrive. Muppets and media have proven to be a powerful combination in supporting the social and emotional well-being of children.
Hi, Julia. I'm Big Bird. Julia?
Back here at home, we've introduced the Muppet Julia to help foster greater acceptance and understanding around the challenges of autism.
All my friends are different. Each one is unique.
Look who's feeling better.
Julia!
Trusted characters give kids the tools they need to handle whatever comes their way.
I think you're amazing. I think you're amazing.
Our lessons can have a life-changing impact and open the door to a better future. Helping children everywhere grow smarter, stronger, and kinder.
This session will feature closed captioning using the CC button in your Zoom window. Please use the Q&A button to enter your questions for the panelists at any time. We will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. And now, please welcome your moderator, NYU and Sesame Workshop alumna, Cheryl Godhelf.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everyone. As our panelists start to join us on screen, I'd like to thank the Sesame Workshop Alumni Network and the NYU Alumni Association for hosting this event. I see Lewis and Hiro and Scott and Shari, fantastic. So I'd like to actually, before we get started, ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves briefly. Lewis, can we start with you?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this, and Masa al Khair to our participants in Abu Dhabi. I started at the workshop looking for a summer job and stayed for 45 years. As one of my mentors, Eli Evans, told me, he said, bloom where you're planted. And so I tried and started at the research department domestically, moved over to the international research group, then moved to international production, became a producer of 2 programs, Rehov Simsim and Shara Simsim, an Israeli and Palestinian version of Sesame Street. And then I became the executive producer of the domestic version of Sesame Street and finished my career at the workshop, back where I started, heading up the Education, Research and Outreach Department, and then retired and finally graduated from preschool. So I'm really pleased to be here. After that, I've been consulting platforms like Facebook and foundations, trying to encourage them to integrate the joy of learning with the power of media.
Incredible. Thank you, Louis. Scott.
Oh, that's easy to follow. I'm Scott Cameron. I oversee production for International Sesame work. And I started as an intern with Shari Cole, who's in the room. And that was 25 years ago. And then I transitioned from the education side into production and worked on Electric Company. And along the way, worked with Louis on Rehov Sumsum and on Sesame English. And am back at the workshop as of about 2.5 years ago, working on all of our humanitarian work and our other international productions.
Incredible. Thank you, Scott. Shari.
Hi, I'm Shari Cole. I'm so happy to be here. I am currently the executive director of Blue Butterfly. We're a small nonprofit that helps producers in low-income countries develop high-quality children's media. Wonder where I got the idea? Prior to that, for 20 years, I worked at Sesame. I was last senior vice president of global education, and I'm just so thrilled to be back here with friends, and it's just a joy to be thinking about all of these things again today with all of you. So thanks.
Thank you. Shari?
Yes, hi. And I suppose that my origin story for Sesame begins right here on this panel when I interviewed for my first job at Sesame Street with Louis Bernstein in 1983. And sadly, I didn't get the job. But in 1990, I joined Sesame Workshop, which makes me a 30-year veteran. And I currently oversee the International Social Impact Department at Sesame Workshop. And I'm currently have the privilege of working with many of the panelists on our humanitarian work, which is what brings me here today. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share with all of you more about the pretty extraordinary work of the Ahlan Simsim program, which is our Welcome Sesame, which is the humanitarian initiative in the Middle East.
Thank you, Shari. And Hiro.
Hiro Yoshikawa. I'm part of the first cohort that watched Sesame because I was 4 in 1969. Don't do the math. But I think I'm on this panel for other additional reasons, which is that I'm a professor at NYU. I'm a developmental and community psychologist. I co-direct a center called Global Ties for Children, where we look at program and policies and their effects on children and youth in low and middle income countries and in conflict affected settings. And I direct the research and evaluation for 2 big initiatives with Sesame and the International Rescue Committee and BRAC in humanitarian context.
Incredible panel on its own right, but as our audience can probably get a sense, they also have worked together quite a bit. As the opening video showed, Sesame has a really long history of addressing challenging issues that face children. And the tradition continues, as you'll learn from today's 3-part panel on Sesame's international work. First, we're going to start out with Louis and Shari, and they'll talk about Sesame's earliest global work, providing some historical context. In part 2, Shari, Scott, and Hiro will introduce a current initiative, Ahlan Simsim, which means welcome to Sesame in Arabic. This show deals with the refugee crisis affecting millions of children in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and it builds on Sesame's prior work. And in part 3, Shari and Hiro will describe how, in partnership with the International Rescue Committee, the project delivers direct services to children and families. Now, work of this nature is going to be challenging in and of itself, no matter what, but no one could have anticipated the impact of COVID. We'll talk about some of the implementation challenges faced by the people on the ground and on the teams. And you'll notice as you see the videos that we share that much of this was shot pre-COVID, so no face masks, hugging people in small places. But COVID is not our focus today. We're really going to work to help better understand Sesame's international efforts. And with that said, let's start with some of Sesame's beginnings. Louis and Shari, Can you kick us off? What prompted Sesame's international work in the first place? What made Sesame decide to get onto that stage? Louis, you want to start?
Sure. Sesame was a smash hit that no one expected in 1969 when it began in the United States. It soon, right after its broadcast, was on the cover of Time magazine. And international broadcasters who were not really interested necessarily in education came to the workshop and said, we want that show. But we said, it's not meant for your children. It's specific to the educational, cultural, and social needs of American children. They said, we don't care. It's a hit. We want it. And so at that time, we realized that even successful programs like Sesame would need to find a way to continue to fund itself. So we said, okay. And they put it on the air. And after they put it on the air, they put it on in a way that we said, this is not the best way to use it. They put it on in English. So if you were a child in Israel, for example, you would hear Bert say to Ernie the letter B, as in boat. And an Israeli child would not understand what he's talking about because he didn't know the alphabet. So we decided to change that model. I'll stop there and pass to you, Shari, if you want to add to that.
So I just to extend to that, when I came to the workshop in '93, there was a continued kind of explosion of interest in international work. At that time, there were probably about 15 co-productions that had been developed that were indigenously produced productions that had their own Muppets, their own characters, their own curricula. But there was an increasing interest in using Sesame for international development purposes, and in particular in South Africa, the Middle East, and some other places. And so there wasn't anyone at the time who was completely oriented towards just international education. And so that's what was developed when I got there in 1993, and we started to work on very specific projects like a program for HIV and AIDS in South Africa. Certainly a project that Louis and I worked on together a lot in the Middle East was a joint Israeli-Palestinian project, and some other ones, which I'm sure we'll get into as we progress today.
So let me just amplify a little bit. And that is, we changed the model from saying, here's the program from America, to a model which said, we'll work with you to show you our formula. We merged educators, researchers, writers, animators, puppeteers, and said, we will give you our best experience and you will then apply it. And so they would produce 50% of their programs, and we would give them our materials that they could choose from to say, these are culturally sensitive to our needs, and we will use some of your Muppets, some of your animations, some of your films. And that was the model that we worked with. And it was different in every country.
So if you were to pull back a little bit and talk about the US version, the original version of Sesame, how did it differ from the international versions? You might want to focus on one international version to make it simple.
Okay, I'll start. I'll talk about one of the seminars that Joan Cooney came to in Israel, where around it we had these educators, psychologists, puppeteers, writers, artists, and they were trying to decide what kind of character should lead their puppets. And someone said, well, if they have a bird in America, that's good enough for us in Israel. And somebody said, no, we should have an indigenous character, the Lion of Judah. And as they were talking, there was a real argument, and an artist sketched the sketch of a puppet who became Kippy Ben Kipod. And it was a puppet that was a porcupine. And he held it up and said, we tend to be prickly on the outside and sometimes sweet on the inside. How about if we use a porcupine? And in many ways, that was very, very much telling. How do people identify their culture? There's Kippy on the left. There's Toccata in France. Toccata from the musical form that was very much part of the artistry and music that France wanted to convey. And Noman in Kuwait, the first production of Iftah Ya Simsim, who was a camel, although he's standing on two legs. So each country defined themselves or tried to find an identity that was somehow emulated through their major puppet character.
Really interesting.
That's not the model we continued with later, as I'm sure Shari Roosevelt will tell you.
Absolutely. Shari, do you want to share with us the role of research in this process?
Sure. I mean, as with Sesame in the States, research was a big part of the Sesame co-productions, both in terms of developing content and also testing impact. And I think in many ways, to me, part of the longevity of Sesame has been this experimental approach. So you try things, test it. If it doesn't work, you move on. If it works, great. But it's always kind of iterating from what you've learned from the research. And I think that approach, that experimental approach, really kind of propelled things forward in terms of being more creative, because you had this license to try things and then adjust. I think on the international plane, you know, we had some opportunities on a research front that we didn't have in the States, and then others that we had in the States we didn't have internationally. And I think, like, for example, when we first started working in Russia, because the program was not at first a nationally broadcast program, we were able to do a randomized controlled trial in Irkutsk, which is sort of an area of Siberia where we actually were able to have kids over a 6-month period, half a group watch the program and half watch another program. And that kind of thing was very difficult to do in the States. But I think
you learned from that, Shari.
We learned that the kids really loved the Sesame, and that they learned some basic skills at a faster rate. And what was interesting in Russia was that they already had a very, very good early childhood system. And so what kids were really learning from the show was much more on the pro-social elements and kind of diversity elements. So it was fascinating on that front. But I think even as Louis was saying, you know, even the research itself and how we conducted the research had to be adjusted for each culture. And so even the questions would be different, the way we would do the studies. And we learned a lot over time, and I think are still learning, but that was a fascinating aspect of the work and still continues to be.
Interesting. You mentioned actually in the control group study you were referring to what the kids were learning. I'm wondering if each of you could talk about or describe how the curriculum in each of these incredibly different territories was developed and who was involved in that process.
So local educators and psychologists were consulted and were part of the design. One of the major differences for international versus domestic productions was that we at Sesame were not producing the international versions. Each country had its own producing group, had its own psychologist, had its own curriculum that they developed. And we would advise about what was easy for us, what was hard for us, and they would make their own decisions. So some countries chose to emphasize cognitive material. In France, they said, our children learn cognitive material. We're going to deal with art and culture. And in the Arab Gulf state production, the original Iftah Simpson, teaching Fusha, modern standard Arabic, was the most important issue for them. So each country had its own particular curriculum orientation.
And the curriculum actually is one piece of it, but we deliver the curriculum for television, but as I understand it, we also deliver it through some incredibly creative outreach. Shari, I'm wondering if you would be able to describe some of the things that people did that was particularly inventive.
Sure. I think there were a lot of innovations on the outreach front. I mean, there's so many stories. You know, in Bangladesh, for example, there were carts that were hooked up to monitors, and the teams were able to bring, and I think they're still doing this today, bring the program to very rural areas, even places that didn't have electricity, with these kinds of carts, and you would get, you know, just large crowds of kids crowding around and watching the program. And in Bangladesh, it was particularly interesting because I remember we did a study it was actually a very large sample, and it came back that the kids, even the kids that were just watching through these rickshaw viewing, and here's the picture, they were learning a lot. And when I first saw the data, I was just very questionable because you'd see these kids and that some of them would be hanging from the tree way far away, and you think, how are they possibly seeing that monitor? It's so small. And I'm not sure they were seeing the monitor, but if you were there and you watched the kids, what was happening was there was this whole culture of Sesame, and the kids would start singing the songs and they would start counting together. And they would learn, even if they weren't seeing the visuals, they would learn by just all the other kids around. And it was really effective. And I think some of those innovations were just amazing. There were some other things that were done, something called the Story Pond, which is this kind of twister board size vinyl kind of just large piece that you can see here. And with this, there was all sorts of literacy kinds of activities that people could do with kids. And these were particularly good even for teachers or caregivers or parents that had low literacy themselves. You could still engage in a literate experience, even if you yourself weren't literate. And this was an innovation that came from different co-productions that we were doing, and then this was adapted in different ways. There was a story pond, a story tree, a story quilt. So some of that's very fun and really innovative.
Incredible creativity and innovation, and it sounds like all aspects of Sesame, which brings us to the end of part one and is a perfect setup for part two, which brings us to Sesame's most recent international show, Ahlan Simsim. Before we get started on the show itself, though, let's have a look at the refugees crisis from a child's point of view.
فلينا الأول اللي قبلنا صار في حرب وشي، واحنا فلينا اجينا لهون. العالم كيف بتموت قدامي. لأن البلد هلا تدمر ما ضمن ماشي. نخاف من عتمة الليل. يعني بس أكبر كني بعرف أقرأ وأكتب هذا الشيء.
The resilience of children, not yet lost, says it all. Shari, can you set the stage for our audience? What did this project set out to do?
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. That film was created for the MacArthur 100 and Change competition. So it was about a little bit more than, how many years ago? I guess about 3 years ago, December 2017, when we were in Chicago, one of 4 finalists left in the MacArthur 100 and Change competition. We had entered with the IRC to win a large stakes competition, $100 million for a single idea, a bold idea that could potentially change the world. And that was really all that MacArthur had put out there. We had already partnered with the IRC at the World Humanitarian Summit and had come together around a question that had already basically been plaguing Sesame for more than 50 years. And I think that was pretty much put forth by Lewis and Shari, like, if not Sesame, then who? And I think since the inception, when Joan Gans Cooney saw television, the power of television to really impact kids, and said, like, is this something that we could gather around and really use this experimental medium to impact kids in a positive way? We've been asking ourselves that question, whether it was Julia and autism, or Cami and HIV/AIDS, or using the power of television to address mutual respect and understanding in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in Northern Ireland and Kosovo. You know, you saw in that film the world's largest humanitarian crisis since World War II. Sesame felt that it had a role to play in addressing the largest humanitarian crisis. And so we came together with the IRC to say, could we do something? And we knew we couldn't do it alone, because the power of media alone could not address the kinds of trauma and crisis that these kids were enduring. But we felt like if we came together with a implementing partner, an organization that had boots on the ground, that perhaps we could do something. And I think that video speaks volumes.
Yes, and actually you referred to it, but just to put a fine point on it, MacArthur and LEGO Foundations are both involved in funding this. Can you describe briefly their objectives?
There's this sort of new term, well, I don't know if it's a new term, but it was sort of new to me in philanthropy, called audacious philanthropy. And I think it's really this idea of groundbreaking philanthropy that is so bold and audacious, that gets you out of the vicious cycle of short-term philanthropy. The average grant in the humanitarian space is 12 months in duration. And if you think about the average length of stay of a refugee is anywhere between 10 and 17 years, a 12-month grant of less than $1 million to $2 million is not going to break that cycle. And so that audacious philanthropy was really, the idea was to, like, help you break that cycle, give you a longer term time horizon to break through, not just reaching, you know, a few thousand children or even a few 100,000 children, but to go beyond and think broadly and think about the research and the impact and the advocacy, so that you can take a longer term time horizon and really impact the sector at large, so that we can create sustainable impact. And that's what this grant has allowed us to do, and is to change our time horizon and change the ability to think big and to think bold and to think broad.
Audacious philanthropy.
Yeah.
I love that. I'm going to put that on my wall. Scott, many of us have not yet seen the television show. Can you share what it's all about?
Of course. So as somebody mentioned earlier, Ahlan Simsim means welcome Sesame, and Welcome Sesame, Ahlan Simsim, is a locally produced show. It's shot in Jordan. It's Arabic language, and it's aimed at children ages 3 to 8, which is a little older than Sesame's typical audience. But as you can see from that video, there are a lot of children who are displaced in the region, who are suffering from a lack of access to education. So it was really important for us to reach the 7 and 8s. And the show is in many ways very familiar to viewers who expect Sesame Street to have a street story. We do have a 12-minute narrative, and it focuses on 3 new characters that we developed. One is Basma, who is from the neighborhood. She's grown up there her whole life, all 5 years of her life. And she's a little like Ernie. She loves to dive right in and try things. And Jad is a boy character, the exact same age, Basma's best friend. And he is new to the neighborhood, so he represents that displaced experience. And to viewers from the region, they might distinguish that Basma has a Jordanian accent and Jad has a Syrian accent. We went to great lengths to find a puppeteer from Syria, which is very challenging in the global context with visas and displacement. But Jad and Basma both represent the experiences of children in the region, one in the host community and the other being displaced. And there's one other Muppet that we created just for the show, Mazuza, who's a baby goat, because baby goats. and because a baby goat who's nonverbal gives us a chance to have some mischief happen that's not intentional, and gives Basma and Jad a chance to be nurturers to kind of a younger sibling stand-in, which is really important for that audience. And it's designed, as I think you said at the beginning, Cheryl, it's designed for audiences in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan. But because we're on a pan-Arab satellite channel, because that's the best way to reach the most children, we are in over 20 countries in the Middle East. So we have to have a show that speaks to the 4 countries I mentioned, but also speaks to that larger Middle East region.
Now, what we see as consumers is the end product, these adorable, charming, funny characters in television shows. But Sesame's development process is really quite involved. Can you describe that for us?
Of course. We always start with a needs assessment. And that needs assessment helps us find out exactly what the children and families on the ground need to learn from our materials, not just video, but print materials and direct services. We then have an educational content seminar. So in this instance, Shari Cole and I, and Shauna Cohn, our colleague on the education side, and Esti Bardanashvili, the supervising producer of the show, we went and we met with a lot of educators from the region, ranging from play therapists who deal with displaced children and children who've been in crisis, to preschool teachers, educators from the ministries of education. And then from there, we make a curriculum that is our set of educational objectives. We make some content, we do formative research to see how that's working. We tweak it or sometimes toss it completely and start from scratch, although we didn't have to in this case. And then from there, as you can see from the chart, we send it out into the world. And in this case, Hiro and his colleagues come in and do a summative evaluation, and we see what we can learn from that.
Wow, that's quite a virtuous circle that you have there. So you pointed out a needs assessment. I'm curious if you could share what exactly you learned from a needs assessment.
Well, in a lot of ways we learned, and this slide shows you I think the first 4 bullets, the first 4 main bullets won't be that surprising to people who are familiar with the region. We found out that caregivers and children need a lot of the things that children around the world do. They're facing regional instability, so they need some kind of stability. They need access to education. Families, caregivers teach their children about culture. Religion is hugely important in the region, and role models for children are really aligned around the things that role models everywhere are aligned around. So helping others, being kind, being smart and strong. The thing that jumped out the most from the needs assessment and from our curriculum development was that the academic skills were most prized for caregivers, so parents and others who are taking care of children. So literacy, numeracy, the things that you need to succeed in school, that was most prized for caregivers. But for practitioners, those are the people working with children on the medical side, on the mental health side, they really prized social emotional skills.
Interesting. So what you learned about the audience's needs was less about what the original Sesame did, sort of ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. It directed you to a different kind of curriculum. Can you describe the curriculum in this particular case?
Sure, and I'll start with a caveat that says that over the years, Sesame, as you can see from that circle, we're constantly doing research, and the research in recent years has shown that we can have deep and lasting impact if we give a dose of educational content that goes quite deeper and that isn't as broad as perhaps the Sesame Street educational frameworks were when I first started. So instead of trying to tackle a lot of educational goals, if we can focus on a few and do them really deeply and consistently, we can have greater impact. And when Shari Cole and our colleagues and I went to the curriculum workshop in Amman, we expected that we would be trying to figure out, how do we frame resiliency? How do we find 3 or 4 main goals that tackle resiliency? And what we heard from everyone, I mean, it was 100% unanimous, was that children, before we do anything else, children need help developing their emotional vocabulary, the ABCs of emotion. Literally learning these 9 words or terms for expressing emotions and feelings. And then how do you deal with those emotions? How do you cope with them? And so we have these coping strategies that you can see here on the screen. So belly breathing is something Sesame is doing a lot internationally, and it's being embraced by a lot of practitioners around the world. Move it out. So being physical, that originally was dance it out, but we knew that dance can be maybe a little too tricky in some contexts. So move it out was a little bit better. But you can see from here that these are some pretty intense feelings. It doesn't tackle every feeling that children who are displaced and have experienced conflict have. Like grief, for example, isn't on the list because that's really complicated to address in a multimedia environment where we can't follow up with children after they turn off the episode and might have been triggered by a traumatic event. So we were very cautious in developing this list.
A lot of sensitivity goes into pretty much every decision you make. When I saw on the screen, it said draw it out. Can you explain what that means as a strategy?
Yeah, draw it out means pick up a pencil or a crayon or a paintbrush and draw it out, draw out your feelings. So especially for children who've experienced trauma and may not be able to or want to talk about what they've been through, art is an excellent way for them to start opening up. And we worked with 2 extraordinary art therapists in Beirut who themselves grew up in conflict and created a practice that helps Syrian refugees and other displaced persons in Lebanon. And they helped us figure out what are some activities that help children externalize their feelings through art.
Excellent. We actually have a clip that shows the curriculum in action. I'm wondering if you could set that up for us.
So this clip shows Basma, the girl Muppet that I mentioned, and this is about her making a plan. I'm frantically scrolling through my notes to make sure I get this correct, by the way. I think I will. This is Basma. She's making a plan, and that's one of our main curriculum goals. It's a strategy for if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling an intense, big feeling, one of the ways to cope with that is to kind of step back, take a deep breath, a belly breath, and make a plan for how to tackle your problem. And I'll let you see the clip because I think people will be able to parse out what she's making a plan to do.
It's a surprise. Let's roll that clip.
أنا حاولت أعمل دربكة لجاد. أول مرة طلعت ما بتشبهها. تاني مرة طلع الصوت مو ظابط.
عادي يا حبيبتي، الواحد بيجرب كذا مرة لتزبط معه.
أنا لازم أعمل دربكة كتير حلوة لجاد.
مزبوط. انت بتعرفي أنا لما بصير معي هيك شو بعمل؟
شو؟
برتب أفكاري وبعدين بعمل خطة.
موافقة. يلا نعمل خطة.
خطوة خطوة يلا ابدأ، لما تخطط رح تهدى. خطوة خطوة يلا ابدأ، لما تخطط رح تهدى. حدد هدفك ويلا عليه، خطوة خطوة رح تبدأ. لا 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 بابا لا لا لا، يلا 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 نفكر بالتخطيط. التخطيط طريق النجاح، خلي هذا الحل مفتاح. التخطيط طريق النجاح، خلي هذا الحل مفتاح. حدد هدفك ويلا عليه، خطوة خطوة راح ترتاح. يلا لا 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 بابا لا لا لا، يلا 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 نبدأ بالتخطيط. كتير حلوة يا بسمة.
شكرا قرقور عشانك ساعدتني.
Sounds like a plan to me. Scott, this is so adorable. What kind of cultural sensitivities did you encounter in dealing with this entirely different region?
Wow, how many hours do you have? One of the biggest challenges was language, and that's a cultural sensitivity because language is, of course, dialects are very important to cultural identity, both within a community and then within a national identity and then within the regional context. And so we struggled a lot. We did a lot of research and a lot of working with advisors to figure out how do we have a balance between Arabic that's spoken in the home, Amiya, kind of more colloquial Arabic, because we're trying to teach children how to articulate what they're feeling. And if we use formal Arabic, Fusha, that isn't what they speak in the home. And so we needed to figure out a pathway that would get buy-in from parents and children, and also from educators and from ministries of education. So that was one. Another one was around how far do we show boy and girl characters touching or interacting. So we made a rule after a lot of consultation and formative research that Basma and Jad don't actually physically touch. We were erring on the side of caution, and I don't think casual viewers would notice that they never touch. They're very interactive and they play together all the time, but they don't touch. But girl characters and boy characters can touch separately.
Got it. So all of this expertise and all of this work goes into the show. How do you know that what you create actually has the intended impact on the audience?
Well, as you saw in the cycle, we do formative research quite early on. Even before that, we send outlines and scripts to our educational advisors in the region. We have language advisors, we have educational advisors, we also have cultural experts. We have inclusion experts who help us make sure that we're being inclusive and that our sets are inclusive, that our characters are acting with inclusivity in mind. But formative research is our first step. We have a brilliant researcher on our Sesame team, Kim Folds, who works with local researchers in different countries around the Middle East to test segments. We get that feedback and then we iterate from there. And then really Hiro and his team are the ones who help pull it all together and get the bird's eye view. So Hiro, I'm passing it to you.
That's a perfect transition. Hiro, actually, before we talk about your work on Sesame, can you give our audience a little bit of a sense of what NYU Global Ties for Children Center is?
Sure, yeah, we do a variety of kinds of research to inform program and policy development and implementation in a variety of countries around the world. So we do impact evaluations, but we also do research on aspects of human development like cultural and contextual influences, right? So that we understand kind of meaningful patterns of human development and learning in kids and youth. And then we also do work with NGOs and governments around issues of implementation and things like monitoring the quality of their services and working in partnership around those kinds of issues.
So if we turn our attention to Sesame then, can you give us a snapshot of NYU's research role with this project?
Sure, yeah. So we are doing primarily, I would say, two kinds of research. And the first and the most important that's been emphasized is impact evaluations. So to try to understand whether these programs are having the effects on learning that they are targeting. Afwan Simsim is a great example, as Scott mentioned, of very focused targeting on certain aspects of social and emotional development. And then for on-the-ground services, we also do quite a lot of, as I mentioned, partnership around issues of kind of monitoring of and working with NGOs like the International Rescue Committee around the quality of their services, how they assess the actual implementation, how families are responding to it. So for that, we use both qualitative and quantitative methods.
So there are a lot of challenges working in these regions. Could you give us a sense of the unique challenges in this territory?
Yeah, so I can build off this program content to say that there have actually rarely been studies that have looked at emotional development and some of these issues that Scott was talking about around the identification of emotions, these kinds of coping strategies for this age range of kids in the Levant area of the Middle East. So much of the research hasn't actually focused on early childhood, or when it does, might have looked at more academic kinds of outcomes. So that's both a challenge and really interesting to develop culturally meaningful measures of emotions, and ones that rely on certain kinds of methods like vignettes that again, make sense and are meaningful within the cultural context where we're doing the impact evaluation. So that takes a lot of work, and it is kind of delving into new areas of research as well as kind of new areas of programming.
We spoke a little bit earlier about some of the changes that that the project had to make overall because of COVID. What kind of impact did that have on your work with parents?
Yeah, so of course, COVID has altered the landscape in every country around the world and created economic, health, and crises related to poverty, as well as educational crises and learning crises. So, so what's happened, of course, is that there were periods of lockdown in many of the countries in which we work, including in the Middle East, in Ahlan Simsim. And so the on-the-ground services, so things like parenting and caregiving services that the IRC was implementing had to shift, and they shifted really very quickly to things like phone and mobile text-based interventions. And so we have pivoted as well to kind of conducting research that is based on those kinds of modes and doing a lot of data collection on the phone, for example, and again, both qualitative and quantitative to understand what's going on. So yeah, so there's been lots of adaptations. COVID has been a huge challenge for the field of early childhood development. It requires attention, not just to learning, but to mental health, well-being, poverty, all sometimes within the same phone call.
Incredible. So what we experience as consumers really is television being very much at the centerpiece of this project, but an initiative like this is so much broader. The next video is actually going to put into context the kinds of services, direct services that reach children and parents. So let's roll that tape, please.
صباح الخير. كيفك؟ Our early childhood program begins in the home, whether it's a shelter, a tent, a crowded apartment, it doesn't matter. كيفك يا أمين؟ The most important thing is that the children need to be with their parents, the first caregivers with whom they will build trusting relationships and learn new things in order for them to be able to build knowledge on the long run. Okay. We give them activities to promote reading, learning the alphabet, counting, a lot of language skills.
تبعت الغسيل شو
كمان الغسيل.
Cells.
We empower the parents with skills to support their child's development. They can play with them using objects that they can find in their homes.
4 5 6 7 8.
We show them how to communicate with their children frequently in a way that promotes praise.
Bravo!
Most of the parents that I work with, when we first meet, they describe their role as shelter provider, food provider, as the one who's making sure that their children survive. Yet with time, they start engaging with their children and they would say, I used to do this in Syria, but I was not able to do it anymore with my kids. Thank you for helping me.
أصابتني عقدة نفسية حتى حنان لهلا تحسيه على طول روح أيضا المدارس هيك ما عاد نفع نبعتهم على المدرسة ولهلا بس بشوف ويسمع بحس ضرب أو ألعاب نارية غزايف يعني هون ما في شيء ماما هون عادي طبيعي ما عنا مثل بسوريا عيد حفلة عيد ميلادي طن طن. نحن بنعرف إن الأطفال إجوا من بيئة مختلفة، بيئة فيها حرب، شافوا أشياء ممكن إنه خوفتهم، يعني في عندهم حالة إنه غير الأطفال العاديين اللي هن رايحين على المدرسة، فنحن لحتى نرجع لهم ثقتهم بنفسهم بدنا نحاول نحن نعمل لهم هيك كلهم، نعمل لهم المكان الآمن، نعمل لهم البيئة الآمنة لحتى هن بيشعروا بالثقة. والمدرسة مأمنت له هالشيء، فهن أكيد رح تأثر بالمستقبل، رح يبنوا مجتمع، أكيد رح يكون مجتمع منيح، مجتمع فعال أكيد. بس عبط تنتن، أنت كده عبط تنتن؟
Cheryl, you're muted.
Am I unmuted?
Yep. There you are.
I'm back. I was just commenting that seeing somebody hug as they enter a home has become more powerful and meaningful than ever before. Shari, outreach. Can you help us understand what outreach is all about and the ambitious objectives of that for this project?
Yeah, it's hard to isolate it. I wouldn't even call it outreach. I would say that mass media, direct services, and then the research and policy, they're each like, it's the three-legged stool without which the whole project would not be as one. It's really integrated and baked into the DNA of the project itself. So the direct services are part and parcel of the entire program design. And it's what makes the partnership between IRC and NYU so essential to the entire program of Ahlan Simsim. I mean, it's easy to think about the television program because we as laymen think in terms of the television program, and we all relate to Sesame Street as consumers of Sesame Street. But Ahlan Simsim is really first and foremost a direct services program that has at its core reaching out to families on the ground. And I think what's so surprising is that media access is pervasive for families in the Middle East. And I know that I myself was very surprised in some of my early visits to the Middle East to see how pervasive television access was, going even into refugee camps, into informal tented settlements, and going into homes that had so little. And yet, even in places where there was so little, you would see cable and satellite penetration. And so you would walk into a home that didn't even have toilet and latrine access, and yet they did have Tom and Jerry cartoons. And I think it was there that we realized that if you could reach them, you could teach them. And if you could build that affinity with beloved Sesame Street characters like Basma and Jad, and then reach them through home visitation, into health clinics, into schools, and build those character affinities with trusted, lovable characters like we all know today, whether it's Elmo and Grover, that we can become through parents and caregivers. And if you think about going back to the day that Joan Gans Cooney first created Sesame Street 50 odd years ago, with adult humor that built those bonds between children and caregivers, and then back to today, and Hero could talk about this probably, that the nurturing care cycle between the bonds between parents and caregivers and what that does in the nurturing care framework, particularly around trauma, and that serve and return parents and caregivers and building that trusted bond. What we could do in that direct services with IRC home care workers, IRC child care workers, and healthcare workers really is irreplaceable. And so by building that connection between mass media and the work on the ground between IRC direct service workers is really just irreplaceable. And so it's not as if we're doing a mass media program and a direct services program that's complemented by research. It's that all three of these components are like pieces of a puzzle that have to be inextricably linked in order to come together and reinforce each other.
Hiro, did you want to add to that?
No, just that, yeah, the mass media materials are being integrated into the IRC on the ground programming, and these are run out of country offices that serve the 4 countries of the project. So Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and a couple regions of Syria itself. So just to give a little context, that the program itself goes wide across the 20 countries that were mentioned before, but the on-the-ground services are concentrated in these 4 countries that comprise the heart of the Syrian refugee response region in the Middle East.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Hiro.
So if you were to characterize the audience that the direct services reaches, who's involved in that? Who are you trying to reach?
So the audience is really both the displaced population and then the host communities in which they live. So refugees themselves, only 20% of refugee populations actually live in a refugee camp. The remainder of them actually live integrated into host communities. And as Hiro just clarified, we're talking about the 4 countries of Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and certain communities within Syria. So we're talking about refugee camps, as well as some of the informal tented settlements in which they live. And then the host communities, those are the communities that are regular communities in those countries that have integrated the refugee populations. And so those are the targeted populations in which the direct services are taking place.
And do you find that they're different? Do you find that the approaches you use with these different communities are different from each other?
Hiro, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, yeah, we have a beautiful qualitative quote from one of the fathers in our Jordanian study, where we asked a Syrian refugee father, you know, how much was there a cultural shift as you came into Jordan? And he pointed out that, you know, historically these are political boundaries, and that the majority of the culture is really quite similar. Yeah, so that was an interesting, so there's quite a lot that is shared among the cultures. At the same time, dialect, there's a lot of other things that are different. And I think it is important that the IRC generally, wherever they're providing services, don't single out displaced and refugee populations. And often the humanitarian sector is much more complicated than refugee and non-refugee. There can be internally displaced populations, there can be returnee populations. And then of course, you know, every country has its own patterns of inequality and poverty and discrimination that might affect different groups differently. So where they have on the ground services, they generally are serving a wider range, though they might, for a humanitarian project, concentrate in areas where there's particularly higher concentrations of refugee and displaced populations.
And Shari, you so beautifully characterized this as a 3 parts, a 3-legged stool. Here I'm wondering, how do you measure these impacts? You have all of these influences. How do you measure the effects on your audience?
That was for
that was for you.
For me, okay. Yeah, so this is a challenging. We need lots of input. So we have, you know, staff on our at our center who are from the Middle East and are from the region and are fluent in Arabic and different dialects as well. And then we work extensively with partners on the ground. So in this case, I should also mention that IRC has its own research department. And so we work extensively with the researchers there. And we really work collaboratively and together on aspects of trying to make sure that, for example, if there's a survey measure, that they are, the language is meaningful. There's a lot of iterative work to try to make sure that the language is going to be understood and accurate to what we're trying to measure. And it is a lot of going back and forth between qualitative and quantitative methods, and people with deep cultural knowledge as well of the strengths of the target population, the sources of socialization and language and transmission of values and beliefs and learning to kids in these different cultural contexts.
The complexity is mind-boggling in many senses, and to reach all of these different audiences, Sesame's Muppets and NYU's Global Ties have traveled around the world to so many different places. I just want to thank all of our panelists for sharing the incredible journey to so many countries, and particularly the work with refugee children and families. And now I'm going to invite you all back on the screen, and we're going to be back home. And before we wrap up our panel and begin to take questions from the audience, and I hope there are questions there, I'm curious if you could briefly share with us, we heard a little bit when you introduced yourself, how each of you found your way to Sesame Street. Go ahead, Louis, you kick us off.
Okay. I saw a kinescope of Sesame Street in 1969 when I was a student at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I was studying psychology. And I said, my goodness, I get what that program is trying to do. I love the cognitive stuff, but really what I cared about was the diversity in the street and the respect that people had who were different for each other. And I said, boy, Israelis and Palestinians could use a show like that. I said, I hope someday I could work on it. And when I finished my master's, I came back for a summer job at the workshop. They said they didn't have any. And I called back and said, well, can I just talk to you? And after that conversation, I was hired. It was a thing of luck and beauty for me.
Incredible.
So I'll just jump in and say my beginning wasn't quite so successful because I came in and talked to Louis Bernstein in 1983, but he didn't say you're hired. He said you're not hired. So I have to find a different way in the door. And I came in and I never let him live that story down. But he did hire me in 1996 to work on the Israeli-Palestinian Sesame Street. And so all roads lead back to Jerusalem. And I worked on the Israeli-Palestinian Sesame Street in 1996 and have been with Sesame Street ever since.
Well, you couldn't have set her up any better, Louis.
Right.
Scott?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I applied for an internship in the international education department because I was a grad student at Columbia, and my professor was Rosemary Tullio, who is in the process of taking on a new job at the workshop as overseeing domestic education. And so I interned with Shari, and the rest is history.
Who wants to go next, Hiro or Shari?
Sure, I'll go. It's not that, yeah, I don't have anything as dramatic, but I just applied to an ad in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I was finishing up my doctorate and I just applied cold, did everything you're not supposed to do. I just sent in the resume. I didn't do anything else. And I got a don't call us, we'll call you kind of letter. And I was kind of like, okay, well, that would have been nice. And then months later, like 6 months later, I was talking to my dissertation advisor, Kurt Fisher, and he said, oh, I heard you're a finalist for the position at Sesame. And I said, really? I haven't heard anything from them. And he had heard it from Jerry Lesser. And so then I interviewed, right after that I interviewed, and that's how I came in. So.
Yeah, so I think my story builds on that in the sense that I taught on the senior faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for 7 years and had an office just down the hall from Kurt Fisher. But Sesame is deep in the DNA of the School of Education with Jerry Lesser and the very long history. And so got to meet Louis and Shari, I think, while I was there, as I believe you all were working iteratively on your educational framework. So I remember some meetings there. But who knew that we'd be working so closely together?
Excellent. Thanks so much. Well, it's wonderful to have a panel with so many crossovers and connections. To our audience, I want to actually thank you to everyone who's entered some questions into the Q&A. on our Zoom. And in the remaining time, the panel is going to answer some of these. So I'm going to read the first question. How did the team reconcile the importance of religion that presented itself during the needs assessment?
I'll start off, and Shari, and I know you'll have a good perspective too. Well, with a lot of conversations and with a lot of, really what we did was start with what are the storylines that best match the educational framework that our team put together. And when you start with that, you find that there are a lot of stories that don't directly address religion. There's a lot happening in young children's lives that, of course, are impacted by religion, but it's not essential to the storyline. And so we tried to craft stories that were really emotionally true and compelling, that had humor and heart, all of the trademarks of Sesame, but tried very hard to avoid presenting particular religious iconography or subjects that might make other people feel excluded, even while including others. Shari, what would you say?
Yeah, I would, just to tag on to that, I think the whole idea of religion is very interesting, and it really evolved certainly over the time that I was working at Sesame. And, you know, there's kind of the American separate religion from school, you know, but then working with, you know, different producers on the ground, including in the Middle East on this project, there was much more of a, you know, religion is our culture. You can't separate it, and you Americans want to separate it, but it's part of us. And so but in a way, that lack of separation is kind of the window in, as Scott was saying, because you tell stories about children's lives, and so you convey their lives, and in doing that, you end up in a space that's meaningful for all, as long as you're being inclusive and you know, doing it in a way that really invites everyone in. And I think that's the Sesame way.
Great answers. Hiro, actually, this one is directly to you. It's a great question. How do you think this program and research design might become part of the permanent landscape going forward? Are there things about it that are scalable? What does the future look like?
Sure, yeah. So I think we participated in the MacArthur process, pointing out how few impact evaluations there have been in early childhood development in humanitarian settings, despite the extraordinary evidence base across neuroscience and evaluation and economics and human development and culture around early childhood development around the world. And so that is still probably the biggest gap that we aim to fill. But I think going back to a little bit on the kind of issues of implementation research, we're also hopeful that some of these approaches to kind of ensuring that services are of high quality and are meaningful to families in the early childhood field, that is really the biggest question, is how do we go to scale? And how do we go to scale in very diverse societies, in situations where families are experiencing, you know, different levels of stress and adversity, some of which is due to displacement, but some of which might be due to other societal factors or community factors or that kind of thing. How do we honor the strengths of socialization in families? And how do we build the tools to measure both program implementation and the kinds of family processes, and then of course children's development and learning in a period of like extraordinary rapid, the first 6 years of life are just mind-bogglingly complex and huge changes at a time of great sensitivity to the environment. So that's a lot.
Yeah, and actually this one is building on that. And if you can give even one simple example of this, Hiro, can you explain in a little more detail how you conduct research on emotional skills? How do you get to that?
Well, I mean, in this case, around the program, we built, of course, from the curriculum. So the curriculum had been built with a lot of input from a whole variety of stakeholders. So we did start with those emotions that Scott put up on that slide. And then, of course, we couldn't just replicate situations from the show when we're doing an evaluation, because we would also be, kind of evaluating this among kids who maybe might not have, well, actually would not have watched the show to the extent that they would, as some other kids will in the evaluation. So yeah, so those are we started with those, and then we developed other vignettes that are everyday situations to try to get at things like children's coping strategies, and then things like how they identify emotions in social situations and those kinds of things. Yeah, a lot of kind of iterative work on the ground. I would say also working with IRC and local teams.
Right, it must be a huge leg up. So for the team, does anybody encounter different types of frustration with local people that you're dealing with, asking for more material help, like, well, we really don't need this, what we need is food and shelter? Or do you experience any kind of rejection of what Western involvement?
I'll give a quick anecdote that I remember was a sign for me that I had a lot to learn, which was very early on when visiting refugees in the camps, being told that bringing any kind of toy or even a handout, a paper activity sheet was not okay, because if you don't have enough for everyone, you can't just give some to some children or some families. And that was, it made absolute sense. And I was, humbled that I hadn't realized that.
Anything about Western involvement? Go ahead, Hira.
Oh, well, so the on-the-ground teams from the IRC are hired from the local communities. That's one thing to make clear. But I do think, and especially under COVID, but even before COVID, this notion that you can go straight to kind of parenting activities in intervention post-COVID, you do have to check in on basics of well-being and poverty, food insecurity, and those kinds of things. So those are, and COVID, of course, COVID health messages. And so those are very important parts of the curricula that are usually earlier in the phone call than the parenting activities. So
right.
And I've seen that in programs developed in South Asia, in Bangladesh, in India, across the Middle East, and Latin America, kind of worldwide.
And I'm sure there's plenty of comments about this. We have two more questions. The first one is, and we've alluded a little bit to this, how has the COVID presence affected the production of content?
We had a beautiful season 2 planned that we were going to produce last summer. We had to scrap those immediate plans and repurpose the scripts so that we could shoot them Zoom style with the characters in their respective homes. And we actually made those scripts be kind of repurposed wraparound for repurposed episodes from season 1. And then those scripts became the foundation of season 3, which is about to launch. And so we kind of pushed things back a little bit. In South Africa, we ended up shooting during lockdown. And the way we did that was we built sets, little makeshift sets outdoors. So we weren't indoors at all, but it looked to the viewers like we were in characters' homes. And that was one workaround. We've gotten inventive, and it can be tricky.
Yes, I'm sure. And Sherry, you referred to this earlier, but it's a really great place for us to wrap things up. What does the future look like here? You mentioned that this is actually a longer term project than many. If you were to look into your crystal ball, what does the future look like?
Well, when we embarked on this project, it was really, Sesame was dipping its toe into humanitarian work in general. We were starting out in the Middle East, and as you mentioned, we're also working in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, with a grant from the Lego Foundation, and we've since also begun working in the Venezuelan crisis in Colombia. So working in the humanitarian sector is something that Sesame Workshop has really embraced writ large. and the learnings that we've taken with it. It's not as if we understand, like we've done one crisis, now you've done them all. Like, you know, each one is something different, but we're taking a sort of a listening approach, and we go in better understanding the questions to ask and better listeners and understanding how to approach each context anew. You know, for example, in Bangladesh, it's very different. The media landscape is very different. In Cox's Bazar, very few families have any media technology, and so we need to understand how to reach them in very different ways. And so we're going in producing content, but trying to understand how to reach our audiences in very different ways. So we're really taking a long view, but I think for Sesame Workshop, we realize this is an environment where we really can make a big difference, not just with individual children and families, but in really increasing our impact in the sector writ large, and in putting a spotlight on the importance of education and early education in the humanitarian sector, and using our convening power and the engaging ability of our Muppets to really make a difference in the entire sector. So we're in this for the long term.
Sounds like exactly the kind of audacious philanthropy you referred to
earlier. I see you like that. You like that, Cheryl.
I do like that.
Yeah.
I want to thank all of you, our panelists, for taking the time to speak about the incredible work that you do and share it with our audience. I want to thank our audience for tuning in and joining us. And I want to again thank Sesame Workshop and NYU for hosting the webinar. And last but not least, I have to thank my behind the scenes partners on this project, NYU and Sesame alumni, Ananda Grant, and NYU staff partner, Tim Valentine. This wouldn't have happened without the two of them. For everyone, please be smarter, stronger, kinder. And we're gonna end our session today the way every episode of Ahlam Simsim begins, with its theme song.